I was never supposed to speak about this. For years, the very mention of the Philadelphia experiment has been dismissed as fantasy, a sailor's drunken tale, or the paranoid delusions of conspiracy theorists. But I can tell you with certainty, because I've seen the files myself, it was real. Back in 1943, during the height of World War II, the Navy was desperate for an edge against German U-boats. Entire convoys were being destroyed in the Atlantic, and America needed something extraordinary to turn the tide. That's when a classified project was launched in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. Officially, it was about creating a magnetic field to render ships invisible to radar. But unofficially, the technology being tested went far beyond radar cloaking. It reached into dimensions mankind was never meant to touch. The vessel chosen for this experiment was a USS Eldridge, a destroyer escort outfitted with specialized equipment unlike anything else in the Navy at the time. Gigantic Tesla coils, massive generators, and an array of field emitters were installed throughout its hull. The objective, at least according to the documents I reviewed, was to bend light and electromagnetic waves around the ship, essentially making it vanish from sight. Yet what they were really playing with was the very fabric of reality itself. As the crew boarded, most of them had no idea what they were about to be part of. They thought it was a simple test of radar invisibility. None of them could imagine that within minutes, they would be witnesses to something that defied human comprehension. On the day of the test, the shipyard was on edge. Civilians were kept away, and only the highest-ranking officers and scientists had clearance to observe. When the order was given, the power surged into the generators, humming so loudly that sailors later described it as feeling like their very bones were vibrating. Then, a greenish haze began to form around the Eldridge. Witnesses reported that the ship seemed to shimmer, as if dissolving into thin air, and then, in an instant, it vanished completely. For a few terrifying minutes, there was nothing where the Eldridge had been, just empty water and a strange electromagnetic distortion in the air. Some accounts claim the ship reappeared hundreds of miles away in Norfolk, Virginia, before blinking back into Philadelphia. If that sounds impossible, that's because they had accidentally achieved teleportation. But the real horror came when the ship returned. At first, everyone cheered, thinking the experiment had been a success. But as the haze cleared, screams erupted from the deck. What the observers saw was beyond imagination. Some sailors were missing entirely, never to be seen again. Others were burned, their skin fused with the steel of the ship's hull. Men were found embedded halfway into bulkheads, still alive, begging to be put out of their misery. A few wandered the deck in a daze, fading in and out of visibility as if their bodies were no longer fully anchored in our reality. The documents described it clinically, but the truth was far more disturbing. The human cause of tampering with forces we couldn't control. And yet, despite the horror, the Navy buried everything under a veil of secrecy. The surviving crew members were changed forever. Some became violent, lashing out at others without provocation. Others fell into catatonic states, staring blankly for hours as if their minds had been left behind in another place. A few men vanished entirely weeks later, dissolving into thin air in front of their families and shipmates, never to return. One particularly chilling report described sailors walking through solid walls as if they were ghosts, their bodies flickering in and out of existence. These incidents were classified as side effects of exposure to the experiment. The Navy doctors couldn't explain what was happening, only that these men had been destabilized on a fundamental level. They were no longer bound by the same physical laws that applied to the rest of us. It was as if the experiment had permanently altered their connection to space and time. Naturally, the Navy couldn't allow such events to become public knowledge. Families of the missing were told their loved ones had died in service, with no further explanation. Survivors were forced into silence, threatened with imprisonment, or worse, if they spoke of what happened. I've seen declassified reports that mention a program specifically designed to monitor these sailors for the rest of their lives, ensuring that no strange incidents drew unwanted attention. The government knew the risks, but they also knew the potential. If they had truly unlocked the ability to teleport entire vessels, imagine what that meant for military power. Wars could be won in seconds. Armies could vanish and reappear anywhere on Earth. And so, instead of shutting it down permanently, they doubled down on research, quietly shifting the program into black-budget projects where no one could question them. But the experiment had opened a door that could never be closed. Witnesses spoke of strange distortions during the test, a sensation of being pulled somewhere else, of seeing landscapes that did not belong to Earth. Some sailors described flashes of barren deserts under alien skies. Others claimed to hear voices not in English, not in any human language. One report even hinted that the Eldridge had passed briefly through another dimension, an in-between space where time had no meaning. Scientists referred to it as the hyperspatial field, but the truth was more terrifying. They had brushed against realities that humanity was never supposed to touch. These sailors weren't just victims of an experiment gone wrong. They were explorers of the unknown, unwilling and unprepared. And what they brought back with them may still linger in ways we can't even comprehend. The Navy officially denied the Philadelphia experiment ever happened. To this day, they insist the story is nothing more than a myth, born from misunderstandings and sailor rumors. But declassified CIA memos I've reviewed paint a different picture. They describe the Eldridge incident as a prototype application of advanced field manipulation, and note that further refinement is required to stabilize human interaction with the effect. In other words, they admitted it worked, just not safely. The files also contain references to other nations attempting similar experiments, particularly the Soviet Union during the Cold War. If America had stumbled into teleportation technology, then it's likely other powers were racing to replicate it. And if they succeeded, the world you think you know, the borders, the wars, the entire balance of global power, would be rewritten in an instant. Some survivors of the Philadelphia experiment were hidden away in secret facilities. I've seen records from Bethesda Naval Hospital that mention non-standard psychological symptoms and unusual electromagnetic interference around certain patients. Imagine that men who could interfere with compasses, radios, even light bulbs just by walking into a room. Some researchers suggested that their bodies were now partially out of phase with our dimension, caught between two realities. These poor men weren't treated as heroes. They were treated as lab rats. Every vital sign, every strange occurrence was documented, analyzed, and weaponized. The government wanted to know if these altered sailors could be used as assets. Could they infiltrate enemy bases by walking through walls? Could their unnatural presence destabilize electronics in the field? To the Navy, this wasn't tragedy. It was opportunity. Over the years, whispers of Project Rainbow began to spread. That was the internal code name for the Philadelphia experiment, though few outside the program knew it. In hidden documents, Project Rainbow is described as a stepping stone towards something far greater, control over space-time itself. The Pentagon believed that if they could refine the technology, they might develop not only teleportation, but also invisibility and even time manipulation. Think about that for a moment. Military commanders having the ability to erase entire battles before they even happened. Entire wars could be rewritten. History itself bent to the will of those who controlled the project. The survivors of the Eldridge had suffered horribly, but to the people funding Project Rainbow, they were just proof of concept. If the technology worked once, even imperfectly, it could work again. I must warn you, the files I've read suggest the experiment wasn't a one-time event. The Navy may have tried similar tests with other ships and aircraft, though these incidents remain deeply classified. Some reports mention aircraft vanishing off radar during control tests, never returning. Others hint that small submarines were used in attempts to apply the same principles underwater. In some cases, fragments of these vessels were later found, twisted, warped, their metal fused in impossible ways, as if reality itself had melted them. And always, there were human casualties. Yet the Pentagon pressed on. The risks didn't matter, because the reward, absolute dominance over physics, was too tempting to abandon. To them, a few ruined lives, or even entire crews, were acceptable sacrifices in pursuit of godlike power. Now here's the part that chills me the most. Some sailors claimed they were not alone during the experiment. When the ship phased out of our reality, they described seeing figures, shadows moving in the strange fog of that hyperspace. These beings didn't look human. Some witnesses spoke of tall, elongated silhouettes, others of glowing shapes that seemed to shift as if made of liquid light. The sailors swore these entities observed them, maybe even interacted on some level. One survivor described a voice in his head whispering, "You should not be here." Imagine the terror of realizing that your experiment had not only ripped you out of this world, but placed you into the domain of something else, something intelligent, and perhaps not friendly. If those reports are true, then the Philadelphia experiment wasn't just a breach of physics. It was a breach of reality itself. What unsettled me most was how the Pentagon responded to these accounts of entities. Instead of shutting the project down, they doubled their efforts. Psychologists were brought in, not to help the men, but to interrogate them, extract every last detail about what they saw, what they heard, what they felt. The reports were cataloged under a new subproject, code-named Gatewatch. Its purpose was clear: to monitor, record, and, if possible, establish contact with whatever intelligence existed on the other side. The Navy didn't care that their sailors were traumatized, broken, or dying. They cared about potential allies or adversaries from beyond our dimension. To the brass, the Philadelphia experiment had become more than physics. It had become the first step in interdimensional diplomacy or warfare. I found evidence that after the Eldridge incident, the Navy quietly reassigned the ship and scrubbed its logs. Publicly, they insisted the experiment never happened. Official records show the USS Eldridge engaged in routine operations in the Atlantic, escorting convoys. But there are gaps. Strange, unaccounted for stretches where the ship's exact location is unverified. Witnesses from Norfolk, Virginia, and Philadelphia swore they saw the vessel vanish and reappear hundreds of miles apart within minutes. To silence these rumors, the government ran disinformation campaigns, mocking the idea as science fiction. But classified memos show that while the public laughed, scientists were poring over reams of data, refining equations, and planning the next trial. The cover-up wasn't about protecting the public from paranoia. It was about buying time, and the time was well used. By the 1960s, research had splintered into several classified programs. Some focused on radar invisibility, which would later evolve into stealth technology. Others dove into more dangerous territory, field manipulation, temporal distortion, even consciousness displacement. Rumors swirled of test subjects placed in isolation chambers while exposed to fluctuating magnetic fields, their minds pulled into strange states of awareness. One file suggested that these subjects began describing locations and events far removed from their physical bodies, as if the experiment had unlocked a crude form of remote viewing. Whether intentional or not, the Philadelphia experiment seemed to have birthed not only the dream of teleportation, but the blueprint for psychic warfare. The Pentagon wasn't just chasing ships through dimensions. They were chasing human minds. Here's where it gets darker. A declassified CIA document I read hinted that some of the survivors didn't survive for long. Men who had been partially fused with the ship's bulkheads began to deteriorate at a cellular level. Their bodies rejected the reality they had been forced back into. Cells broke down, Organs failed, and no medicine could stop it. The official cause of death was always complications from service injuries. But the truth was far worse. They were dying because they no longer fully belonged to this dimension. To cover it up, the Pentagon buried them with honors. Their families never told what truly happened. Each coffin lowered into the ground was not just a burial. It was a sealing of a secret. And for every grave, the project pressed forward undeterred. By the 1970s, whispers of the Philadelphia experiment began leaking into the public sphere. Books were written, journalists poked around, and sailors who had been stationed near the Eldridge started telling stories they had once sworn never to repeat. The Pentagon responded with its usual playbook: discredit, ridicule, deny. They released statements calling the experiment a hoax, a misunderstanding, or outright fantasy. But the timing was suspicious. Around the same years, rumors of Project Montauk surfaced. Another program allegedly building on the Philadelphia experiment's findings, this time focused on mind control, time manipulation, and interdimensional gateways. The connections were too strong to ignore. If the Philadelphia experiment was a lie, why were so many other programs echoing its technology and theories? To me, the denial only confirmed the truth. What still keeps me awake at night is the question: what if the experiment never truly ended? The technology, once unlocked, couldn't simply be buried. Engineers refined it, physicists reworked equations, and the CIA applied it in psychological warfare. I believe modern stealth technology, certain classified aircraft, and even experiments in quantum computing all trace their roots back to Philadelphia, 1943. And what about those entities the sailors described? If we open the door once, even briefly, what's to stop them from finding their way back through? Every so often, I've read accounts of anomalous signatures near naval bases, brief spikes in electromagnetic activity, unexplained radar contacts, strange lights on the horizon. To the untrained eye, these are dismissed as glitches. But to me, they look like echoes, like the experiment never stopped reverberating. The tragedy is that the men at the heart of this experiment were forgotten. Their names are barely mentioned in history books. Their sacrifices erased to maintain secrecy. These were young sailors, ordinary men, drafted into something extraordinary without consent. They didn't know they'd be used as test subjects for a weapon that could shatter reality. The Pentagon buried their suffering under layers of classification, turning human pain into data points. When I served, I met older officers who spoke of them in hushed tones, with a mixture of awe and fear. They called them the ghosts of Philadelphia. To me, that phrase was literal. These men walked into another dimension and came back changed. They were never fully part of this world again, and the government knew it. Now you understand why I risk speaking out. The Philadelphia experiment was a myth, wasn't a sailor's tall tale. It was the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one that tampered with the very structure of reality. The Pentagon will deny everything I've told you, but the documents, the testimonies, the patterns across decades all point to one truth. We open a door we cannot close. The Eldridge was just the first casualty. The greater danger is what still lingers, what still waits in the shadows of that experiment. Every time I hear about a strange disappearance at sea, every time a pilot vanishes from radar without explanation, I wonder, did they stumble into the same storm the Eldridge did? If so, they may not be lost at all. They may just be somewhere else.